It was my cousin Justin and my uncle Mike that pulled up instead. And again, my heart's racing. I'm finally seeing people I know, like, thank you. And then we get in the car and start driving. And that's when I finally worked up the courage, because nobody said a word. It was like everybody's crying, everyone's sad, like, what's happening? And we start driving. And that's when I finally asked my uncle Mike, I said, where's my dad? And that's when he turned around and told me that my mom too had passed away. So 5 hours from when my mom passed away, my dad then passed away. And I never thought that when he said those words to me, get on the next plane you can, I'll be at the airport to pick you up, that would literally be the last time that I would talk to him.
Hello, my grieving friends. It's your host, Lisa Keefauver here. Welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Now, just in case you're new to the show, this is a podcast all about grief. Over the past 6 seasons, we explore the expansiveness and the pervasiveness of grief in our lives. What I've learned over 20 plus years as a social worker and now more than a decade of being a widow is that when we lean in, hold space, bear witness for one another in the most difficult seasons in our lives, that's where healing and true belonging can happen. Now, today's guest became an orphan overnight. She was just 18, a freshman collegiate gymnast at Rutgers University, when she got a call in the middle of the night that changed her life forever. Today, you might know Lauren Sisler as a national award-winning sports broadcaster who's been captivating audiences on ESPN since 2016. Not only is she a powerhouse in the broadcasting world, but she's also the author of the compelling new memoir, Shatterproof. As a sportscaster and former gymnast, Lauren is passionate about sports, but even more passionate about telling the stories of the coaches, the athletes, and the fans who make it more than a game. Lauren's life was not always marked by victories, however. As I mentioned, in 2003, as a freshman at Rutgers University, tragedy struck when she unexpectedly lost both parents within hours of each other to their hidden battle with prescription drug addiction. Through her grief, Lauren emerged from the shadows of shame and found renewed hope. Her message is clear: confront adversity with bravery, own your story, and let it propel you towards a future filled with greater meaning and fulfillment. I can't wait for you to meet her. Welcome, my friends, back to a new episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm here with my guest, Lauren Sisler. Welcome, Lauren, to the show.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me. It's always an honor to have these type of conversation. I love your podcast and just what you're all about. And so I'm looking forward to digging in today.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. So the listeners heard at the top of the show a little bit about your story, which we're going to dive into more deep today. And it's detailed really vulnerably, I would say, honestly, through reflection and love and expression of your faith in your book, in your memoir, Shatterproof. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the copy here, and you can also see that I
All
have
the notes.
tagged
What?
and taken a few notes in there because I think, I've had so many conversations about so many kinds of losses over the past 6 seasons, and certainly loss due to addiction has come up and will continue to come up. But I think I was really moved by your story of coming to grips with the importance of telling your story, the honesty, sometimes the shame and the cultural baggage that we carry around addiction and loss. And so when your team reached out to have you on the show, I was really excited to dig into this important conversation that millions of people in this country alone are navigating that kind of loss related to addiction, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, grief, obviously, just from that, because, one thing that I've kind of realized through addiction, grief obviously happens at the loss of a loved one,
Yeah.
But throughout addiction and when you have severe illness like this,
Yes.
the grief really carries itself throughout the entire illness.
Absolutely. And we're going to dive into that in this episode. And I'm so glad you talked about it. That's that kind of ambiguous grief that happens when someone is still physically present, but psychologically or emotionally distant, which can happen from things like Alzheimer's or dementia, which many people, again, listening might be experiencing that with a loved one, but certainly happens with addiction, with significant mental illness, et cetera. And that's its own flavor, for lack of a better word, or kind of experience of grief. But I wanted to ground our show, our conversation, where I ground all of my conversations of the past 6 seasons. And that's just an invitation for you to share, to model um, how it is you came to your own grief beliefs. As I've shared over these 6 seasons, when I've taught the loss and grief course at universities, my assumption is that we all move into adulthood with some set of grief beliefs. And we learn that from the implicit and the explicit messages that we get when we go through an early loss, often in our childhood. For some, it takes till later. And the reason I invite folks to sort of explore that, I just want to give this caveat if you're a new listener, is not to go back and bash our parents for doing a quote unquote bad job and not showing us how to do grief, because for a lot of people, that's the answer that they give, but it's so that we can make a choice now. How are our grief beliefs serving us or not? How might we want to shift them so that we can both walk in our own grief in a different way that's more meaningful?
Hmm.
And for those of us who choose to have kids or have friends or colleagues, we can also pass on a different way of thinking. So when you think back to your childhood, it might have been your mama, I think I read in the book, but what was an early memory of loss, and what did you notice about how the adults were showing grief in the aftermath of that loss?
Yeah, when you reflect on that experience, right? Because we all will experience that first loss, whether it's, a family member, a grandparent, a parent, or a hamster, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
you
We've
will
had pets on this show for
the
sure.
pets,
Yep.
well, the pets, absolutely, part of the family. And, that first experience with grief, actually it was one of our dogs that had died at an early age because of cancer. But my first experience was my mama, my dad's mom. And, my dad's dad had already passed away and I never met him. So my dad's mom was very close. She lived with us at this point in time when she did pass away. And, her and my dad were just very, very, very close. And so I just remember that particular experience of getting to spend a lot of time with her. She had some heart issues, a heart disease within the family. She ended up having a bypass surgery that really extended her life by about 10 years. And, really just having that and, having that closeness with her, spending a lot of time with her, and we were living in her house. She would stay with us a lot of the time. And then she'd also stay at her brother's house. But, I just remember, specifically where I was, because as she was sick and being taken to the hospital, to see if, to try and survive, this heart attack that she was experiencing. I remember being sent to my friend's house and being told, "Hey, we'll call you when we get home from the hospital." And the thought was, well, I'm going to go to my friend's house and I'm going to come home and I'm going to get to go to the hospital and see my mama, and I'm going to get to, she's still going to be alive, right? And then just getting that call and hearing my friend's dad on the other end of the phone, you could just hear the defeat in his voice. And I knew when my dad said he was going to walk up the hill and come get me, just the sadness. And I remember walking down the hill, because she lived up this hill in our neighborhood, holding my dad's hand and just feeling this sadness for him. Right. I mean, I was devastated, obviously, as a young girl, but the sadness that I knew that he now felt, that his mother, now his second parent, had passed, and just that grief, the heaviness of that. And so, in those moments, I'm obviously feeling for myself, but then I'm also feeling for him in that as well.
Yeah. Do you remember when you look back, and we'll talk a little bit next, because one of the things the listeners heard at the top of the show that we're going to discuss today is the profound loss of both of your parents at 18. So this was a time between those two. But when you think about the days, the weeks, the months after his mom's death, were there stories told about mama? Was there picture out? Were emotions shared, or did sort of things get sort of shut down and put away? What do you remember about sort of what it meant or looked like to grieve as your dad displayed that or not in the household?
Yeah, I mean, I remember early on, memories, and of course, you're going to the funeral and you're experiencing people in and out of the house, and and I think that's kind of how grief sometimes, carries us, because a lot of times there's just a lot that's surrounding you
Yes.
in
Yeah.
those moments, in those weeks, and then all of a sudden it's just like,
Yeah.
right, and you almost feel like this loneliness, and of course this is also very fresh for me, and as we talk about
Yes.
my parents' death, and kind of feeling that. But in those moments I also remember too, um being concerned, because my dad was an alcoholic, and he had lost his father on his 25th birthday. So my dad was 25 when he lost his father, and I just remember always kind of connect, and again, I wasn't alive, but connecting the two. So a lot of times when holidays would come around, my
Yes.
dad's birthday would come around, that's when you would see my father struggle the most with the drinking. And so I will tell you, even as young as I was at that time, I did struggle with just the thought of, okay, how is this going to impact my father and his
Yes.
drinking? Because I knew, even at 9, 10, 11 years old, I didn't really understand what drinking was. I didn't understand alcoholism, but I did understand the emotional piece, and that
Yes.
something would trigger my father to act differently and to decide to go to the bottle. And I did have some concerns even at that age of like, how is this going to impact him? And it certainly did. I think, and I don't necessarily remember a specific timeline of when things, because his cycles were like, every 6 months or so he'd relapse. And I just, I kind of knew like this was going to be another hard time of the year for him,
Yeah.
to deal
Okay.
with. And then also just the fact that neither one of his parents were with us anymore.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that and also sort of linking through to that even at a young age, we know things
Hmm.
about our parents, even if we can't quite articulate it or we don't have the adult language. And that's part of why I asked that opening question. I just want to sort of like pivot to the listeners to say is that I think there's a lot of assumptions that we have about not talking about loss or our own grief feelings with our kids. But I think it's such a disservice. Of course, there's the age appropriate language, but kids know when you're feeling bad. And to pretend it's not is to sort of do a disservice to your child because then they're sort of like, well, I can't trust what I notice about people's emotional life. And so I think I just name that as part of your story, which is common. And almost every guest I've ever had has a version of, you know, that there was sort of a disconnect between the adults
Yeah.
coping with their feelings and what they were communicating with their kids.
And
Yeah.
I'll say this to kind of piggyback off of that thought process, because I am now a mother of an
Yes.
18-month-old.
Yeah.
And, I will say that I do feel like, and I saw this in my parents a lot, was, they're the ones that have to be strong and have to keep it all together. And so I think that a lot of times as the parents, are navigating these things, a lot of times I feel like there's this shift in which they think, well, it's not my time to grieve because I've got to be here for my
Yes.
wife and my children. I'm not going to show that. And then of course my father being a male adds a whole nother layer to
Right.
the emotional, and
Yes.
also
Yeah.
being in the military, being trained to,
Yeah.
to act and do those things a certain way. So I will say, I think inherently, like a lot of times we as now adults, we feel like it's like passing the baton. Now I've got to be the tough and strong one. I can't show those emotions when
Absolutely.
I'm around my children. And so that's something I think I'll be learning,
Yeah.
as I continue to learn and figure out this
Yeah.
whole motherhood thing.
Let me tell well, welcome to parenthood and
Yeah,
motherhood.
yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
a journey. It's a
Uh-huh.
journey. It's an amazing journey, and you're gonna just keep figuring it out as you go. That's the thing to remember. Um, yes, I so appreciate that, and that makes me want to invite you to the degree that you want to. I mean, you spell it out quite really honestly, importantly, beautifully, if beautiful is quite the right word, but like just really with integrity what your life was like growing up before you went away to college. You sort of I don't think addiction was, it sounds like you had some inherent understanding, but you definitely knew there was issues with debt and always having to sort of borrow money. Maybe you knew and there was pain. Your mom had some pain, your dad had some pain, but also a very loving family. So sort of the backdrop of what did you know up until you went to college about what was happening for your parents and what was the backdrop of your family life before the devastating losses happened?
Well, I'll tell you what. Let's put it this way, Lisa. I think that as humans, and maybe for me specifically, because I was an athlete,
Right, that's
I was a
right.
gymnast. So a very competitive sport, one that, like any sport, just has a lot of challenges, but really had become a, almost full-time job for me. And I had put my head down and was competing and wanted to be a collegiate gymnast. So that was sort of my goal. So I
I
will
saw
tell
something there, I
you,
just wanna interject. I saw something there was like 20 hours a week in elementary school, is that right?
yeah,
Do I have that
yeah,
statistic
you
right?
do. You do.
That's
One of your many notes. I know. Isn't that
that's
crazy?
crazy. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead, sorry,
Yeah.
I just wanted to, like, so just to paint the backdrop of, like, that was the level of commitment intensity that you were committing, but also, when you're a child, that means your parents are having to, you know, you can't just do all of that on your own, that's impacting
Yeah.
sort of what your
Yeah.
parents are showing up for, yeah.
I mean, yeah, and that's the investment, right? And that's what they're showing up for. And I'll tell you, the sport of gymnastics really, I think, charged me with learning how to compartmentalize things really well.
Okay.
So when you ask, like, how much did you know? Um, First of all, my parents were darn good at putting up the
Keeping
facade,
secrets
making
and yeah.
everything look great, right? I mean, that's what they were good at, right? And so things were good for a while, but I will say, there were the setbacks, obviously, with my father and his drinking, and I will tell you, when those setbacks would happen, when he would relapse, usually it would be a spending spree, or he'd have to take time off of work, and so it always seemed like when a relapse happened, it was a setback, right? You take 2 steps forwards and 10 steps backwards. So, but of course, didn't understand the magnitude of that, right? Like, I'm getting up, I'm going to school, I'm going to gymnastics, I'm doing what I'm
Your
doing. And so,
day-to-day routine is kinda, you're
yeah,
still charging along, yeah.
yeah, charging along, and not for me to worry about. Okay. It's really when I transitioned into high school. So we moved out into the country, and as outlined and as you mentioned in the book, we moved out to the country. My parents had acquired some land, and I think that's where things really took a turn. And so, number one, with my parents' health problems, especially my mom, the degenerative disc disease that ultimately sent her to a pain management doctor to get, that sort of treatment and help with the chronic pain she was experiencing. My father also had chronic pain. So they started going to the same pain management doctor around the time we moved out to the country. And it was our dream home. The problem is, with that dream home, it came with a lot of expenses. It's out in the middle of nowhere. We go to dig up the property and there's a ton of rocks. So now all of a sudden your budget's doubled because you've got to, like, excavate the whole land and do all these different things. And then running, electricity was double the price it was supposed to be. It was almost like the dominoes, right? You just see
Yes.
this dominoes start falling. And in the midst of that, my mom's health problems begin. It was just like this perfect storm of things that were happening. And as you mentioned, the financial problems is then you see, okay, we're living in, and I say a beautiful home, beautiful country. It was still, a modest, 2,000, 2,200 square foot type of home out in the country, but everything brand spanking new, and it was everything we needed. But then you add to that the stress of living out in the country. My dad's commuting to work over an hour each day. I'm now commuting to gymnastics over an hour. So you're adding those stressors to it. Mom is now on disability, or trying to seek out disability because of her health issues. And then, of course, being way over budget. And then mom's not working anymore. So now her part-time income's not coming in, and dad's, pulling the weight with the finances. And then all of a sudden the mortgage gets a little behind. They're going to my grandparents to, ask for money, and they're stroking $10 checks to the, power company. And, I think that was something that I kind of got a little sense of, as I was getting my driver's license and starting to drive more, and just maybe become a little bit more aware. But it was always expressed to me like, it's going to be okay. Like, this month's a little tough, but like next month we're back on track. And it would seem that way. Like, it would seem like, okay, back on track, we're good to go. And then, it was just, again, it was almost just this facade that was put up that like everything was fine. And, I think my grandparents, my mom's parents were helping, with the mortgage here and there. And, I think that's the one thing is that people weren't asking a lot of questions. And I think my parents were really good at kind of dodging any questions and really making it seem like there's no need for you to ask because we're good here. We're good here. But then next month they're asking for, well, I don't even have $100 to put in the gas tank. I need a little extra cash here. So,
Right. Yeah. And you talked a lot about in the book that your mom's parents, I think as Aunt Linda, if I'm getting that correctly, your aunt and uncle were involved. They were giving money frequently. They were really supportive of you and your gymnastics, and your brother, I think, who was older than you, was already maybe out of the house by the time you were in high
yep.
school. But you sort of allude to the fact, to your point that you just made there, that like, and this happens, I imagine, if you're listening and you're in a family with addiction a lot, you as a young person maybe didn't really know. They were helping, they were wanting to ask questions. Maybe they wanted to know, maybe they had a hunch, but they kind of maybe had a hunch something was going on. I think you talked about your Uncle Mike, maybe, had some suspicions, but that happens so often in families with addiction. And also, let's remember, we want to put this in the context. This was the early 2000s, right? So this was like the whole opioid epidemic wasn't necessary. I mean,
It was not in the forefront at
in the
this point.
zeitgeist kind of the world. So they couldn't necessarily put two and two together that what they might be seeing in the family is part of this bigger story going on. They just knew your family was struggling. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing too, when you think about like the questions, because you are trucking along, you are doing a life. And I think sometimes you get into this mindset of like, okay, everything's okay. They're going to figure it out. They always do. And so in many ways, you almost try to like disconnect from the reality of the situation, because as the teenager in the house, my job is to go to school, make good grades, go do gymnastics, right? Like you almost feel like you have like a job, like a job description. Like,
Yes,
so this is,
yeah.
you focus on this and we take care of the rest. And I think that's always kind of how I felt. And as you mentioned, I had an older brother, Alan, 2.5 years older. He was going in the military. Like that was his life, and we just were kind of put on this sort of, hey, you're not, this ain't for you to worry about. Let us figure it out. Right.
Which makes sense. And again, that's very normal, right, for our families. And also, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but when we're young, even in high school, but definitely when you're younger, but even in high school, it's sort of an existential threat to think that your parents don't have it all figured out and that they're not going to take care of everything and that everything's going to be managed. It's like we need as young people to trust in a way that our parents, got it all together and they got it all figured out, right? So of course, it's like, why would you even look to that? That would be too much of an inner threat. And you, as you mentioned, gymnastics, this was your passion. This also came with a lot of pain, like highest injury rates. I know you experienced a lot of injury and a lot of pain, but your path was to take this to the collegiate level, though you weren't sure, right? Because then there was a chance where maybe you were going to go into the military like your brother. Maybe you were going to take the gymnastics, but you knew you were going to leave home and do something with your, yeah.
And, it's funny, I'm sitting here thinking, as parents, like you mentioned that. And now again, I've got an 18-month-old, I'm sitting here thinking like, man, like my parents, I feel like my parents might've had it more figured out than I'm sitting here thinking like,
yeah, they didn't.
You don't have like a manual for this thing. And I'm like in many ways, sometimes I'm like, how am I surviving right now?
Yes.
And so it's just funny when you kind of put yourself in their shoes, but
yes.
They were doing the best that they could. And I think that's where, there's so many things to kind of take from that. And I will say that we had to support. And I think that's one thing that I feel very much gratitude for is the love and support, the unconditional love that my parents had for us. Right. So as I'm pursuing those dreams of becoming a collegiate gymnast, that was not, those weren't just my dreams. That was my parents. Right. And that was the investment that we all put into the sport and into my future. So having that support, that unconditional love, because, you hear stories all the time about families that are just, well, let's be real. Come on, Lisa. We know every family is dysfunctional, like just underline every bit of it, right? You like to think your family's not dysfunctional, but hey, we're all dysfunctional in some sort of way. That's life, but
we're all perfectly imperfect. That's how it goes. Most college freshmen are worried about making friends, figuring out how to pass classes, and for some, how they can pay the bills of their day to day lives. As a college athlete, that is just the beginning. You're living and breathing practice, performance, and for Lauren, finding a spot on the team. When we come back, Lauren walks us through what happened the second semester of her freshman year when she got the call that changed her life. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. Although I love being able to reach and support thousands of people each week through the show, my passion is working directly with you, with people navigating grief. That's why a few times a year, I have openings for a 6-session package of individual grief support. And during our time together, you'll feel held and cared for, have a chance to tap inward to discover your existing skills, discover some of the barriers or shoulds getting in your way, cultivate a mindfulness practice essential for easing suffering, identify your emerging needs as a griever, and begin to build the community of support you'll need as you continue on your journey. To learn more and to reserve your spot today after the show, visit lisakeefauver.com/support. Life is happening so fast, and I want a place where we can slow down, dive in deeper, and figure out how to metabolize it all together. And I'd love to have you join me. That's why I'm building a community on Substack called AFGO with Lisa Keefauver. Now, AFGO, if you haven't heard me talk about it in my book, from the stage, or even here on my podcast, it stands for Another Fucking Growth Opportunity. Yeah, of course, I had to get in a judicious use of cussing. And rest assured, my friends, like I do in all my work, I'll show up authentically and offer thoughtful, meaningful, and practical guidance on how to center aliveness in a world full of loss. And frankly, I'm just going to show up to let you know a little bit more about me. And don't worry, if you like things delivered to your inbox without having to search the web for it, AFGO with Lisa Keefauver will be delivered directly to you. You can head to Substack and sign up at afgoWithLisaKeefauver.substack.com, or just head to my website at lisakeefauver.com and sign up there.
Absolutely. And we definitely don't have it all figured out. But, for the most part, I just felt like, life was going as scripted. I'm on my way. I get this college scholarship to go compete at Rutgers. I got the rejection stamp from Air Force Academy, which was unfortunate because I actually did want to be a sports doctor because, as you mentioned, right, I had a lot of those challenges and setbacks. It's like, okay, maybe I could be a sports doctor or athletic trainer and help athletes get back out on the field to play. So that was really the dream. And that's why Air Force Academy was going to be the ticket because of the financial aspect of it. But that didn't work out. My SAT scores were bad. So, all right, moving on. So I ended up getting into Rutgers, which is also a very prestigious, academic institution. So I was very grateful for that opportunity. And then the scholarship dollars that were attached. It wasn't free. It wasn't a full ride. My parents still had to take out a student loan. And a little did I know, right, that, that scholarship to me seemed like such a big deal, but I just didn't understand the magnitude of like, well, we're going to give you this scholarship, but you still got to figure out the rest. And like, the rest wasn't there. Like the rest wasn't there.
I feel like it was 9,000 out of like 20,000 or something. It was not an insignificant.
It was basically kind of like a halvesies.
Yeah.
Yes. And you just, as a kid, okay, you're going to Rutgers. This is awesome. You've got the scholarship dollars, but then also just understanding like how much it costs to like do life. Even just to buy toothpaste and deodorant and all those things, like it all costs money, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you detail in your story. So if Shatterproof in your memoir, Shatterproof, you sort of get to college, you thankfully end up becoming very close with your roommate, Kara, and you're having, regular communications with your family. You'd gone home for Thanksgiving. Your dad had what you later recognized was maybe a near overdose, but a heart event. taken to the hospital. You go back to school thinking like, okay, it's fine. And they figured it out. Things are moving on. And then to whatever detail you want, what you share in the story. Again, I always say, I just want to name to the listeners, this isn't about being a voyeur into people's tragedies. It's actually, my invitation always is, how do we learn how to talk about our losses? That includes the way people die, to the degree that we want to talk about it, so that we can all be more comfortable when we're faced with whatever our inevitable situation is. Because as my favorite party opening line is, 100% of us are all going to die. So it's, going to happen to all of us. But 18, you're doing this thing that we're supposed to do at 18, which is, you know, trying to land on your own 2 feet, trying to differentiate, find your way in the world. You're still very close with your family, of course, but, in theory, your main problem should be like, am I going to have a romantic relationship? Does so-and-so like me? Am I going to make,
Yes.
for you were worrying about, am I going to make the team? Am I going to be able, not make the team, but am I going to be able to perform?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So we're only
Yep.
into
The lineup.
the lineup, right? So we're only into the second semester of your freshman year. You're 18 years old and you get a call from home, from your dad in a panic state, right?
Yeah. And that phone call, of course, comes to me in the middle of the night and really kind of out of nowhere because, I had spoken with my parents this particular evening, every evening. I always talk to my parents, and I was 8 hours. It was an 8-hour drive door to door to get to Rutgers. And, as you mentioned, I was home for Thanksgiving. They did come visit me in February. They saw me compete, and, I was doing life as usual. Like nothing
Yeah.
seemed out of the ordinary. I talked to both of my parents, and when I got this phone call from my dad in that panic state, I hear the words, "Your mom died," and I was just like, "What? Like, what do you mean? Like she's 45 years old. It's the middle of the night. Everyone seems healthy. Like we just talked on the phone. Like
How is that
that.
possible?
Like
Yeah.
how's this possible? Right? It just hits me. And the only thing he could tell me was, I need you to get on the next plane and I'll be at the airport to pick you up. So he gave me no indication, like literally no indication as to what happened. Like I had zero information.
And it's 3 a.m. your time or
Three
whatever,
in the
something.
morning,
Yeah. So
3 in the morning, no information. I'm 18 years old. Lisa, I had no credit card. I had $50 to my name. How am I getting on a plane? This was back before you could just log in and
right,
like book a flight,
right. This
like
is 2003, right?
2003. Yep.
3. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Just
so like I'm
because
sitting
you're
here.
young, there was a time where you couldn't just, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
log on. Yeah.
2003, y'all. I will say I am 40
Yeah.
years old now. I've hit the 4th floor. Here we
Hey,
are.
I'm in the 50s. It's good. Welcome. It's
So
fine.
welcome to the 5th
Yeah.
floor, baby. Right. I
Yeah.
love it. But like, yeah. So, it's just like, I'm literally having to navigate this thing practically on my own. You mentioned my roommate, Kira, bless her, because she just kind of stepped in and just helped me take the reins. But, we're two 18-year-olds scrambling the jets, trying to figure out like, what do I do? And then all while grieving the fact that like my plane is going to touch down and my life has changed forever.
There's a
And my
before
mom
and after, and
is
that's
not
what
here.
this moment is.
This
Yeah.
is it. Yeah. The before and after. So like, even when I finally make it home through all this disarray, my life has changed. My life has changed significantly. And so I'm just trying frantically, figuring this all out, finally get a ride to the airport, get on a plane, get home. And of course, I had every anticipation, every thought in my body was that, okay, I'm going to land. I'm going to get home. I'm going to see my dad. He's going to help us just figure it out. I don't know what this looks like, but he's going to help us figure it out. And, never in my wildest dreams as my plane touches down. And, here's the thing. We lived out obviously in a rural community. My parents did not have cell phones out there because there wasn't a cell service. And so I had not talked to my father, but as I'm making my way home, I was a little concerned, and I talked to my brother, hey, like I had not talked to him, and I know he had not talked to my father, but like nobody had really communicated with my father, but I hadn't communicated with anybody to tell me that we hadn't communicated with my father. So
Right.
the last thing he told me was, I'm going to be at the airport to pick you up. And that's what I thought, so as my plane touches down, I run outside, I'm looking around everywhere. It was my cousin Justin and my uncle Mike that pulled up instead. And again, my my heart's racing. I'm finally seeing people I know, like, thank you. And then we get in the car and start driving. And that's when I finally worked up the courage, because nobody said a word. It was like everybody's crying, everyone's sad, like, what's happening? And we start driving. And that's when I finally asked my Uncle Mike, I said, where's my dad? And that's when he turned around and told me that my mom too had passed. 5 hours from when my mom passed away, my dad then passed away. And I never thought that when he said those words to me, get on the next plane you can, I'll be at the airport to pick you up, that would literally be the last time that I would talk.
Yeah, that those would be the last words you ever heard from your dad. Yeah. Yeah. I just wanna pause and just take a moment for your mom and dad. Yeah. Um, 18, right? And here you are in this double shock of losing both of your parents, getting ho thankfully, weird word choice of words to use maybe, but thankfully you have the loving support of your aunt, of your uncle, of your cousin. Your brother's making his way home. You talked a little bit in the book that about the sort of harrowing journey of the investigating or the detective maybe who you talked to years later, which I thought was a really poignant story, but of kind of what went on. I don't know how you want to carry that story forward versus like what did you know then versus what did you find, because you knew something in the beginning that something was not quite right about the way they passed. You got the records that you left sealed, I think you shared for 10 years because you
10
weren't
years. Yep.
quite ready to face it. So you sort of told a story that you semi believed yourself that there was just this bad coincidence of accidents, and the illness of the pre-existing illnesses of your parents. But how did you start to what did that early time look like of trying to understand how they died, and how do you think now about how that impacted your early grief, understanding or not understanding kind of the reason for their deaths?
Well, and I think it's interesting that when you face such trauma and loss like that, how our brains can be so powerful, right? Like, I was always a very, like, honest, like, always honest, and
Yeah. Yeah.
always told the truth, and almost sometimes to a fault, right? And I was the prize pupil, and I was Miss Tattletale, always telling on my brother, trying to get him in trouble, and then here I am, like, with this information or lack thereof, right?
Yeah.
Because I really refuse to, like, accept and acknowledge. And I think that's what's interesting. So as I'm writing this book, I want to give a shout out to Holland Webb. He was very instrumental in helping me write this book. And he really had to kind of help me dig deep, right? Asking me these questions of, like, but I don't understand. Like, there's this newspaper article out there that says her parents likely died of overdose, and yet, like, you're completely oblivious to it. And I think that's where it's amazing how it's like my body and my mind went into fight or flight,
Yep.
right? And literally just shut it all down. Like, I'm
Yes.
talking just shut it down. And I knew that my mom was struggling with pain and was taking medications. And in my mind, I manifested this whole thing. And I mentioned the words respiratory failure in the book as well, how I'd, like, latched onto those words. But in my mind, respiratory failure was not a choice. It was not that she physically put a pain patch in the freezer, pulled it out of the freezer, cut it open, and sucked on it. Like, that never entered my mind. All that stuff,
Yes.
I literally just pushed so far away that all I could think was, well, my mom was in a lot of pain and she was taking some medications, and,
Had the side
the,
effect that happened.
it was just a side effect of the medications, of just, it eventually just shut her body down because they were just extremely potent. Like,
Yeah.
it was never a choice. It was never this happened. And just thinking back on that, part of that is just being naive to what addiction was and
Yeah.
understanding that. Right. But also kind of being naive to the fact that my mom was, not use the word capable, but my mom is human. And she too felt the sufferings of this world, the pain, the internal pain, and then the sadness and the anxiety and the things that come along with that, right? And so, um, it was just so easy for me to continue to, like, just
Yeah.
dismiss. Like, mom, it was just this terrible side effect from this medication. And I truly believe that, like, my dad, like, just his heart stopped.
Died of a broken heart,
Oh,
which,
broken heart. Like you
you know,
hear that.
yeah.
You
And
hear
there is
that.
a thing. There is actually a medical symptom that happens that's a specific syndrome. However, often used. Yeah. But you will latch onto that. And two, I want to say, like, for young Lauren, and I would say this to anybody who lost the parent or experienced a trauma and sort of latched onto a story that maybe wasn't the full story. You just lost your parents. You couldn't afford to lose the version of your parents you thought they were by
Yes.
acknowledging that this was a result of their own addiction.
Yes. Gosh, I've never heard it put that way, but yes, that like truly encapsulates because again, I had this vision and this, I was holding my parents in my hands at this point, right? And their legacy, but that
Yes.
legacy and that version, as you mentioned, was what I had created over the years and what I saw them as.
Yes.
Because I think that everything's subjective, right? How I view my parents and how other people view them. But myself and my brother had a unique relationship and a closeness with them. And so of course, my perception and my connection to them is going to be different than someone else's, right? But all that to say is like, yeah, it's like I was preserving the version that I knew of them at all costs.
Yeah. Which again, I hold, 18-year-old Lauren in my heart, and to anybody who's struggled with that and couldn't come to grips and maybe with the death of their loved one that was a result of addiction, is like to have so much deep compassion for that version of you who wasn't ready to sort of really see the full story. Because of course, how could you have? That would have been too almost like existentially annihilating, right? And so just to understand that. But part of what you document in the book, you went on to, you finished competing, you went into sports or a different kind of broadcasting and started your career on your way to now what we know as ESPN broadcaster. But you always had that envelope, and that envelope was given to you soon after your parents' death that was the autopsy, correct? Envelope that would really tell. But you sort of document in the book, you made an intentional decision. I'm going to keep it, but I can't look now. Well, what was the sort of crossroads at that time when you said, "Okay, it's time. Like I'm ready to know now."
Yeah. So basically you go from the 90 days after they passed away because they had a 90-day deadline to get these toxicology reports out
Yes.
there and these autopsies. It took every bit of 90 days. And I just remember my aunt walking out from the coroner's office. I refused to go in there. I sat in the car. She comes out, hands it to me. Do you want to look? I said, no, threw it in the floorboard. That was it. Bye. See ya. Don't want to look at it. And really that crossroads of 10 years passed. Then I finally decided it was time. And, 10 years of just telling the story, being asked by, people and, when you're in a close knit group and a family, I'm going back to Rutgers and telling this same story to everybody. Mom died of respiratory failure. Dad died of a heart attack. And even my athletic trainer, who was a medical professional, said, who am I to say that what she's saying is not true? I think there was some red flags and there was some, I don't know about this, but who am I to say that this isn't true? And who am I to stand there and correct her?
Right. Like they knew that you needed to believe that, whether you really believed
Yeah.
it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
And
also
now,
then you're returning to a peer of people who have never experienced what you've experienced too. So I want to hear about that 10-year mark, but you're reminding me that because this is so often the case for people who lose parents young, like you were not surrounded by people who, though you have a very loving roommate, it sounds like, and a friends, how did you navigate grieving around a group of people who could not even conceive of what you were experiencing? Did you feel still supported by your friends, by the coach, by the university at that time when you look back? Navigating college is never easy. But how do you do it when you're returning after the tragic, complicated death of both your parents? When we come back, Lauren explains the mixed bag of her experience when she returned to Rutgers as a completely changed person. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. In case you didn't get to join me live in LA last November at the Endwell conference, or haven't had a chance yet to see the full video of my talk now available on YouTube, I wanted to share a snippet of this topic I'm so passionate about: how we figure out how to center aliveness in a world full of loss. I shared. And that's why I'm on a mission to center aliveness in a world full of loss, or as poet Jack Gilbert so eloquently asked of us, to have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. Now, sadly, our culture reinforces actions that lead to numbness and deadness instead. Most of us in this room are skilled and practiced at avoiding, controlling, distracting, dissociating. I'm seeing some knowing nods there. Yeah, right. Now, don't be mistaken. Aliveness is not a synonym for happiness. It doesn't require us to always walk around being cheerful and positive and grateful. And don't panic. Aliveness doesn't require us to jump out of airplanes or scale high peaks either, I promise. It simply means we don't get to choose our emotions a la carte. That to lean into our aliveness, though counterintuitive and certainly countercultural, is to feel everything, to build our capacity to hold and welcome and metabolize both our individual grief and our collective grief. We must be present to what animates us too. The musculature, the strength and flexibility required to attend to our sorrows is the exact same that allows us to engage with hope, feel connected, nurture our souls. So I'm not standing up here today asking you to choose between either bearing witness to your grief or being actively astonished by the beauty of this world. It's not either or. It's both and. When I invite my clients to be with their grief, yes, I'm serving as a safe container and witness as they find the courage to turn towards their loss, to discover that they are a companion to their sorrow rather than being their sorrow. And in equal measure, I remind them that if we don't allow delight to dazzle our senses, if amazement doesn't make us breathless from time to time, if the only story we tell ourselves and one another includes the hardness and depravity of this world, then we lose twice. I hope you can hear how passionate I am about this topic. And if you're looking for an inspirational or educational speaker for your next event, please reach out to me at lisakeefauver.com. If you'd like to watch the full talk delivered at the Endwell stage, you can find it on YouTube at Lisa Keefauver, MSW.
I definitely felt supported, but I will say there were times where I just felt lonely in all of it, uncertain. And I will say, I had a teammate that had lost her brother before my parents had passed, but she had experienced that. And that really was probably the closest thing anybody on the team had experienced in that time frame. And I think that was obviously very challenging. But yeah, I think that's the crazy thing with grief. And, I know we'll dig into that a little bit more as we kind of unpack some of the story, but, it's wild how you can be surrounded by so many people and yet still feel so alone.
So lonely. The isolation and the loneliness, because you're lonely for the version of you that you were in the before, who could walk in a world and know that your parents were alive, and like you can't even recognize that version of yourself, but also because the everyday problems of the people around you are so disparate from your own that you can feel lonely in a room full of people. It's really about the quality of our connections. I was just having a conversation with Allison Gilbert, who wrote The Joy of Connections. It's really about the quality of our connections, not the quantity. And so I think you told a story in the book about like one of your gymnastic peers, yelling at their mom and hanging up the phone and saying like, "Oh my God, I hate my mom sometimes." And here you have
Yes.
just lost your mom. Like, talk about a disparate lived experience in that
Yes,
moment.
and
Yeah.
I just the anger and, like, just the gut punch I felt in that moment of like, "Oh, well, I'd trade you places any day," kind of thing,
Exactly.
you
Yeah.
know?
Well, thank you for pausing there in the story, because I just wanted to name that because I think it's such a common experience. I've had Claire Bidwell Smith, grief therapist who's lost her parents on the phone, lost her parents young and others. And I think there is just something unique about, and even, I was 40 when became a widow, and none of my friends had ever lost a partner or spouse. And there is a unique grief can be isolating, but I think there's a unique sense of isolation that happens when you're experiencing something in an out of order time like you did, that your peers weren't there. But you found your way, you had family support. I know you stayed really close with your family. But 10 years, what was that moment that you thought, "The story that I've been holding, that I've been sharing, I need to know more." Why do you think, looking back at that time, you made that decision?
Yeah, I mean, 10 years. So obviously my parents were 18 at the time when I'd passed. So, fast forward to being 28. I think there's a level of maturity that comes as you inch closer to 30, even though I felt like I was still a child. And I look back now and I'm like, you always think like
Still a
as you get
baby.
older, you get through these decades. And then I'm thinking, man, like, how did I even survive my 20s? And, how did I survive my 30s? And now here we are, right?
Yeah.
But I will say, a lot of it has to do with, first and foremost, my auntie Linda, my mom's sister. I think she did her best to try to help me to understand the truth. And she did it in a loving way, but really would just kind of push a little bit like, hey, this is really what happened. But I would just shut her down, shut her down, shut her down. And I wanted nothing to do with it. And a lot of it, again, was the perception, the judgment, the fear of what people would think if they knew how my parents died. And I was like, you're attacking their legacy, you're attacking them. That is not who they were. Um, because I had associated addiction with a character flaw, with something super negative, and I had those perceptions of what an
Yeah.
addict was, so I knew for sure everybody on the outside was going to have that same perception and perspective. So I had just kind of pushed it out for so many years, but truly, as I kind of navigated into this world of broadcasting, and I'm out there like sharing stories and just seeing the impact of stories, and seeing how things this ripple effect, so to speak, of how,
Yeah.
when you open up and share a story. And so I'm holding on to this thing. And, honestly, again, I had gotten to this place where it was like, well, here's the story. I guess I kind of got to hold on to it now. But it was almost like I just kept feeling this pull of like, Lauren, that's not the truth. And, you know, like maybe I do need to dig a little deeper. And I felt like I had just like, I love my parents so deeply, but it's almost like I had just kind of propped them back up on like this surface, and I wasn't willing to like dig any deeper. And it was almost, and you bring this up once again, this is like the second thing that I hadn't even thought of. Because I feel like my relationship with my parents was way below the surface, right? I had this like deep relationship with them. And in some ways, by not telling the truth, I felt like maybe I was losing a hold of that
Mm.
relationship and a
Yeah.
hold of who that person was and those people were. And I tell you, Lisa, when I started sharing their story, right? I opened those toxicology reports at 10 years after it happened. And a part of it, the biggest reason was because we were doing it. Our TV station was really talking openly about drug addiction. Because fast forward, right, 10 years and people are now talking about it.
The
And
epidemic.
so
Yeah.
I was like, okay, it's time to unpack the truth here. And when I tell you that, when you love someone, right? When you love someone and you love an individual, and in this case, my parents so much, right? I didn't realize that I could love them more, and my love for them could continue to grow even in their absence.
Yes.
And I'm telling you that when I started to talk more openly about it and quit running from the truth, like, it's like my love just blossomed, and my love
Mm.
for them just went back under the surface, like just dug up underneath the surface. And I think for so many years, I had kind of lost that sort of that deep love for them because I was doing everything I could to almost avoid, avoid, avoid,
Yes.
avoid, avoid.
Yeah. Which then ironically kept you more distant from them because you're really having a surface level relationship with the
Yes.
surface level version of them. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. I've had a lot of memoirists on the show over the time, but you're making me think of, listeners might remember my conversation with Ronit Plank, or most recently with Kathleen Blackburn. And both of them talked about how, sort of humanizing their parents in the wake of their loss by writing the memoir and really digging into the complexity that they were not these cardboard cutouts of humans, but that they were these deeply flawed, loving, important, like they were the whole human, and how powerful that was to what you just said, to their own relationship blossoming and growing even after the death, but also for them as permission giving to be perfectly flawed, amazing, beautiful humans themselves. Because when we hold people to a certain flat story, especially after someone has died, then we sort of don't give ourselves permission to be in the messiness of what it means to be a living human either, too.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. I love that. And I think to your point, the cardboard cutout thing is like the perfect way to like
Yeah.
express that, right? Because you are losing when you lose an individual, you lose that touch and you lose
Yeah.
that the sensation piece of it, right? And so now you're kind of having to pour that into like your spiritual sense and to the internal sense into your heart.
Yeah.
And to your point, the more that you kind of push that out because you don't want to acknowledge
Yeah.
this thing, the more that you kind of lose that. And I will say, I was so fearful of what people would think, especially the people that loved my parents, my coaches and my family and the people that grew up around them, my friends, my brother's friends, my brother's family, my brother's friends' parents, my friends' parents. Like it was always just this massive fear of what everyone was going to think. And what's wildly crazy about it is that they still love my parents just the same, if not more, because they now understood them a little better and understood why they sort of disassociated towards the end and why they were struggling so much and why things had become so challenging for them. And we're almost like, wow, like these were two people that still fought mightily
Yes.
in the face of this terrible addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that so much. And again, as a reminder to all of us, and we have to find our way in our own time. So there isn't a right or wrong time to kind of come forward with the whole story or to interrogate your own family's whole story. But I think to understand that and to maybe set down, to your point, the fear that people were going to draw some kind of conclusion, but just like it just allowed them to also see more than a cardboard cutout, or actually maybe have some questions answered for all those other people on the periphery who loved your parents too, and to be telling that story. So, I want to recognize, I mean, there's so many details we could go into. And if you're listening, definitely pick up a copy of Shatterproof so that you can dig a little more into the story. But I want to make sure we cover, as we begin to head towards the end of our conversation, how you've come to understand and be involved in addiction in a different way, and how your storytelling around addiction and your own work with people who are experiencing addiction, like how has that shifted your grief, how you show up in the world, your relationship with your parents? What has so because there was a version of you who was like, addiction bad, it's a character flaw. You had that, which culturally that was the story, and still some people still tell that story, but that was sort of the story early 2000s that we are telling. What have you learned about addiction that's been informative to you and is impacting sort of how you're showing up in the world now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, first of all, I think two things that come to mind. Number one is empathy, like just this deep empathy for people that are struggling. And here's the thing: addiction comes in so many different shapes and sizes, and it's not just substance abuse. There's so many different
Yes.
forms of addictions, and we have to acknowledge that as well. And you mentioned kind of like the flawed nature of who we are. In many ways we're all kind of tied to some sort of addiction, something that we rely on, something that someone told us tomorrow you can't have any more of that, you'd be,
Yeah.
so I think that's all perspective. But I will say, number one, it has just pushed me so much deeper into empathy for people and this understanding of, we are going through so many challenges. And I think a lot of times we are silenced by that. We are silenced by the fear of what people are going to think and judgment. And my goal has been to become a voice for those that feel they've been silenced in their struggles.
Yeah.
Because there was a time that I felt that. And there's a time that I know my parents felt that. And to be able to, and I use this word exonerated because to me it's such a powerful word when you think about being imprisoned and then you suddenly get released and
Yeah.
you're now free, like exonerated, because I finally got to a place where this is the story, this is what it is, this is how it all happened. And it doesn't, the idea, my parents aren't defined by how they died, but by how they lived their lives. And so I look at that amongst people around me and recognize like the struggles and the pain and have that sort of empathy. And while it's never, oh, well, I know how you're feeling, because I can't possibly jump inside of you and know how you're feeling, but I can empathize in a way where I can hold your pain and your hurt in my heart, and we can just sit in it. Let's just sit in it together. I'm here for you. And I would say empathy, and then also gratitude. Like gratitude is something that has just ignited in my life. And I think that is the gratitude for the good and the bad, because I do truly believe that we are shaped by our experiences. And while I would do anything to bring my parents back,
Yes.
I truly think that, the gratitude that I have for life and the joy that comes with the blessings that we have, in our lives. Because here's the thing, you're never going to experience 100% joy,
Yeah.
but it's not always going to be 100% bad either.
You
Right.
can't
So you're
have
kind
one
of
without the other, and the more you turn towards acknowledging the lessons or the truth of the human experience, which is to have suffering or to have pain, the
yes,
more you can also access joy, and the
joy.
joy helps you carry the pain when the pain comes, because the pain will come. And I actually think we just suffer unnecessarily. That's where real suffering comes from, when we
Yeah.
don't open ourselves up to the both of those things
Yes, the both
existing
and
in
I
our
know. And my
lives. Yeah.
therapist has worked on me with the both and all the time, because
Yeah.
I think we do also live in a world, in a society where you feel like you've got
Very
to pick a
much.
side. Pick a side. You can't have
Yes.
both. Pick a
Yeah.
side. But no, like there are a lot of areas, and in this case, when you talk about joy and you talk about sadness and disappointment and grief, it is both. And I think that's just an important part of all of this, is to understand. And so that is really where gratitude comes in, that, if we can shift some of our thinking and understanding, like, you are going to face grief and loss. It's going to happen, without a doubt. But to understand that, those things can be taken away from you. It's helped me to be where my feet are. And I think that's one thing I mentioned in the book as well. A lot of college coaches, as I'm in locker rooms and talking to these coaches, it's something they preach to their players a lot. And the first time I heard it said was by Nick Saban, Alabama's now former football coach. I was like, wow, be where your feet are. And I understand it now, because I do feel like in life, we're constantly chasing that next thing, next thing, next thing. Got to get there, got to get there, got to get there. And even now as a mom, it's helping me to realize, like, man, it sucks changing dirty diapers all the time. My dude's over here throwing a fit, like, oh my gosh, it's so hard to be a mom. But then also like the joy and the blessings that come
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. And that, like, someday you're gonna miss that they need you to change their diapers in a way, and the sort of intimacy
Yes.
of that,
Yeah.
and to be and that you get to be both. Like, you get to be like, changing dirty diapers is disgusting, and I hate that, and,
And
like, what a
he's dancing
precious.
around in his diaper, and it's so
Yeah.
cute. One day
Yeah.
he's going to be all grown up and he's not even going to want to hug his mom. So
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a really beautiful place for us to end our conversation today. Hopefully we will stay connected and we can continue to
yes.
have more, but I just
I know.
so
I feel like I could just talk to you all day long, Lisa. I feel
well,
like we this
yeah.
55, 56 minutes that we've been going here, or
Yeah.
54 minutes. I'm looking at the timer here.
Yeah.
Has just flown by.
Oh, well, it's such a pleasure. Listeners know this is my passion. I love being a conduit for people's stories and for helping us to put our stories in the context of our larger culture, and recognizing how impactful the sharing of our stories can be to other people's lives. And I know you've experienced that on the receiving end, and now you're experiencing that as someone who's telling your own story. So, listeners, I'm going to drop it in the show notes, but you can pick up a copy of Lauren's. Uh, Memoir, Shatterproof. I'll drop the link in the show notes. And Lauren, thank you again for sharing your story there and sharing your story with us here on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast.
Thank you, Lisa. And I just appreciate the great work that you do, because these are the type of conversations that can really help people to step out of their fears and
Yeah.
take ownership of their stories. And that's where I come in and say, you know, my mantra has become fall in love with your story. And it's even the messy parts. And so I just encourage people to really just step out of their fears and take ownership of that and know that your story matters. And it's beautifully imperfect, as you said.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Thanks for listening to this important conversation on the intersections of addiction, grief, and storytelling with my guest, Lauren Sisler. If you'd like to know more about her story, you can pick up a copy of Shatterproof online or at your favorite local bookstore. That's where I love to shop for my books anyway. You can discover the important work she's doing as a journalist, speaker, and storyteller by visiting laurensisler.com. Did you love today's conversation with Lauren? Did you learn something new? Did you feel seen in your grief? If so, I'd love your help ensuring the show gets out to other grievers who might need it too. One way you can do that is by leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening or watching this episode. Thanks to Giles Smith of Alafia Sounds, as always, for the music. Okay, my grieving friends, remember that, grief is a sneaky bitch, but don't worry, I've got your back. Until next time, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.